Our passage from Isaiah this morning was part of our discussion this past Wednesday in our after-school program, Shine, as we talked about the season of Advent. Now, earlier in the year, we had used this same passage and focused on the first 5 verses that describes the type of leader that the people are to look for. But this time we focused on the next 5 verses, on the description of what some refer to as the peaceable kingdom that is to come. So we talked about all the images that were there of wolves and lambs, of leopards and goats lying down side by side, of infants playing safely over the nests of snakes, and lions eating hay next to cows. We talked about how they reflected the peace that we look forward to in Advent, and that how we look for ways for this vision, that we can both work for it and anticipate God doing so, and living out all these in our ways of following in our faith. As I pointed out that these verses were the concepts of a predator and the prey were then abolished, for they lived together. And they are an image of what God will do when the reign of God is evident throughout all creation. The conversation took an unexpected turn. One of the kids raised their hand and asked, "So does this mean when this happens, we can't eat meat?" As someone who loves a good steak, I'm hoping that's not the case. But what I answered was that we don't know exactly what will happen, and that is a possibility. As I thought about it later, though, I realized I really should not have been as surprised as I was by that question. And not only because kids ask the most unexpected things. I probably shouldn't have been so surprised because this is the kind of practical issue that human beings have wrestled with when we struggled with how we are to live in this world in peace. Over the centuries, artists have depicted Isaiah's vision, and at the same time, others have wondered if it is just that, a vision that is ultimately impossible to live out. Yet there are those who still see that the peaceable kingdom described here, while it may not literally happen this way, is not only a possibility in the future, but is something that we can work for and live out today. And one of those people was Nelson Mandela. Since Nelson Mandela's death on Thursday, tributes have poured in from all parts of the globe. They've lifted up his many actions and the events that formed his long life, including his fight to end apartheid in South Africa and his historic election as the first democratically elected president of South Africa to a united country. He was affectionately nicknamed Madiba by his fellow South Africans, many who also called him father, seeing him as the father of their nation and the reason that South Africa not only survived, but began to heal after the end of apartheid. At his death, fellow activist and South African Bishop Desmond Tutu paid tribute to his friend in this way. Over the past 24 years, Madiba taught us how to come together and how to believe in ourselves and each other, a unifier from the moment he stepped out of prison. He taught us extraordinarily practical lessons about forgiveness and compassion and reconciliation. Fellow Nobel Peace Prize winner and former South African President F.W. de Klerk also paid tribute to Mandela. He had worked with Mandela after apartheid ended and had also been part of the government that imprisoned Mandela before succumbing to world pressure and freeing him in 1990. Still, de Klerk spoke fondly of Mandela's legacy. He described it as his commitment to reconciliation, his remarkable lack of bitterness, and the way in which he did not only talk about reconciliation, but he made reconciliation happen in South Africa. As part of the South African National Congress, Mandela was involved in the fight to end apartheid for decades beginning in the 1940s. For many South Africans and for the world, he became the face of the struggle after his imprisonment in the 1960s, especially as we got into the 1980s and the economic boycotts and sanctions began to gain wider use. But its work after his release from prison, especially in the early years as he assumed his presidency over this divided nation, that many remember and still lift up. For at that time, he established a government that included opposition leaders in key positions, including members of the party who had opposed the end of apartheid. He established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that focused more on reconciliation and providing amnesty than on seeking punishment for the crimes committed during the fight over the end of apartheid. And he continued to reach out to white South Africans, seeking to transform past symbols that showed separateness into sources of unity and of national pride. One way he did this was in the embracing of the national rugby team at the 1995 World Cup. As the games began, he joined the team on the field, donning their team jersey and cap, which up to that point had been a symbol of white privilege and separateness. During the whole games, he cheered on the team and eventually led the whole nation in a celebration when the team took the cup, both whites and blacks celebrating together, something that was previously unheard of. What was so remarkable about Mandela's efforts was the radical commitment he displayed not only to the freedom for his people, but how he came to believe that those in power needed to be freed, not vanquished. In his autobiography, he writes of coming to that realization in prison, that the oppressor must be liberated just as surely as the oppressed. A man who takes away another man's freedom is in a prison of hatred. He is locked behind bars of prejudice and narrow-mindedness. The oppressed and the oppressor alike are robbed of their humanity. Our images today in Isaiah reflect something different than what is normal when there is revolution or there is change. Usually when an oppressor is overthrown, they are either punished, run out of the country, or become part of the oppressed people themselves. Something or someone is always the predator, and something is always the prey. But what the prophet's words describe is instead a time when there will be a radical reorientation, when there are no longer predators and prey, but when all people live in peace together. It will be a time of shalom, of God's peace, lived not only in nonviolence, but with justice, dignity, and abundance for all people. Such a peace entails not only the lack of war, but also a radical transformation in how we relate to each other. Mandela himself came to understand this and worked for such a radical reconciliation in his part of the world. And so, upon his death, a variety of world and religious leaders took time to lift up Mandela's commitment to this work of reconciliation without retribution. Pope Francis spoke of Mandela's forging a new South Africa built on the firm foundations of nonviolence, reconciliation, and truth. President Obama referred to Mandela's commitment to transfer power and to reconcile with those who jailed him. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu praised Mandela's works, his work to heal rifts with the South African society, and succeeded in preventing outbreaks of racial hatred. And another spoke of the personal qualities of Mandela that allowed him to commit to such work. Former U.S. President George W. Bush talked of how Mandela bore his burdens with dignity and grace, and our world is better off for his example. Former U.S. President Clinton, who is honored to be also called a friend as well as a fellow leader of Mandela, spoke of his friend as a man of uncommon grace and compassion, for whom abandoning bitterness and embracing adversaries was not just a political strategy, but a way of life. In the midst of all these tributes, I think it's important for us not to fantasize who Nelson Mandela was. As he himself would often say, I am not a saint unless you think of a saint as a sinner who keeps on trying. In the early 1960s, Mandela had reluctantly renounced complete nonviolence in response to the government's violent retribution towards those who led anti-apartheid efforts. In his autobiography, he describes his hatred of those who imprisoned him and others, often tormenting them with hard labor and with complete isolation from the world. And later he would argue with governmental leaders that it is always the oppressor, not the oppressed, who dictates the form of the struggle. And so if the oppressor insisted on using violent means, the oppressed would eventually have to do the same. And prior to his arrest in 1963, he became leader of an offshoot of the ANC called the MK that began sabotage attacks to disrupt business as usual in South Africa, but to do so without the loss of civilian life. Yet it is precisely those imperfections and struggles with hate and violence that I think we can find our own hope in our own struggles and how we live out peace. Mandela did not easily abandon his bitterness, nor did he always embrace his adversaries. For like the nation that he was part of reconciling, he too had to reconcile within himself those all too human feelings of fear, hate, and resentments, with a love for others that went beyond mere tolerance to a true living together. Our world leaders have given many tributes in these last few days to Mandela. And perhaps one of the best tributes that they could give is to not only lift up his accomplishments, but also to live out in that spirit. But perhaps it's a rock star, U2's Bono, whose tribute is the most accurate assessment of Mandela's impact on the world. Bono stated, "In the end, Nelson Mandela showed us how to love rather than hate. Not because he had never surrendered to rage or violence, but because he learned that love would do a better job. As we go through this Advent season, may we remember that this is at the heart of what we celebrate at Christmas. That in Jesus, God declares once again that love, no matter how hard it is to live out, will always do a better job of bringing about peace. Amen. If you looked at the sentence sermons in the bulletin this morning, you see that I had included a quote by Nelson Mandela. At the beginning of this week, as I started to put the service and the sermon together, I had planned on mentioning Mandela briefly as one of but many illustrations of how this peace is lived out. But then with his death, as I read his tributes, and I went back myself to his autobiography, I thought, given his presence in the news this week, what better sermon could there be than Nelson's life for this passage of Isaiah's vision of the struggle to live in peace? At the 7:45 service, I had said in the benediction that we probably won't be affecting world peace in the same way as Nelson, that we won't be leading countries in reconciliation. And then between services, I recalled that Nelson, when he did his main work of reconciliation, was after he got out of prison and was in his 70s. So who knows among us? As we go about, I challenge you to be about the work of peace and reconciliation in your lives. And who knows, maybe one of you can be one of the people that helps lead, maybe not a nation, but a community into the peaceful kingdom that God's reign promises us can be lived today. May God bless you and keep you until we meet again.